Idris Lancaster had built an empire from the ground up, his billion-dollar corporation spanning across industries. But at this moment, he stood in the middle of a bustling office with nothing but a cheap ID badge clipped to his shirt. It was supposed to be a simple experiment going undercover as an entry-level employee in one of his newly acquired subsidiaries to observe operations firsthand. What he hadn't expected was that the woman calling the shots, his new boss, was someone he couldn't take his eyes off. Penelope Hayes. She wasn't what he had anticipated. He had expected arrogance, entitlement, someone who got lucky climbing the corporate ladder. Instead, she was sharp, passionate, and completely unaware that the man she was giving instructions to was the owner of the entire company. Idris, right? Penelope glanced at him, her hazel eyes scanning his name tag. Yes, he replied smoothly, shoving his hands into his pockets to avoid the instinct to command the room like he normally did. She barely gave him a second glance as she continued addressing the team in the conference room. We have a tight deadline, and I don't do excuses. If you can't handle the pressure, this isn't the place for you. Understood. A chorus of agreement followed, but Idris was too focused on her. She was different from the women he usually encountered, ones who fawned over his wealth and power. Penelope didn't even look at him twice, treating him like any other employee. He should have found it amusing. Instead, he found it infuriatingly attractive. By the end of the day, he had learned two things. One, Penelope was the kind of leader who earned respect, not demanded it. And two, he was in serious trouble. Because the longer he stayed undercover, the more he realized he didn't just admire her. He wanted her. The next morning, Idris arrived at the office early, determined to understand what made her tick. He watched as she moved through the workspace, checking in with employees, offering advice and solving problems without hesitation. She was brilliant, and she had no idea who he really was. Idris, she called, snapping him out of his thoughts. Can I see you in my office? There was a tension in the air as he followed her inside. She shut the door behind them and crossed her arms. You've been asking a lot of questions, she said, tilting her head. You're observant, but you don't act like someone who's just here to do a job. What's your deal? He leaned against the desk, keeping his expression neutral. I'm just trying to learn. Her eyes narrowed. People don't ask those kinds of questions unless they have an agenda. He almost laughed. If she only knew. Instead, he shrugged. Maybe I just like understanding how things work. Penelope studied him for a moment before nodding. Then prove it. I have a client meeting tonight, and I need someone to assist with the presentation. Are you up for it? He hid his amusement. If only she knew she was asking the CEO of the company to assist her. I'm up for it, he said. Good. She grabbed a folder from her desk and handed it to him. Be at the restaurant by 7. Don't be late. When he arrived at the upscale restaurant that evening, Idris felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years dodging opportunists, but for the first time, he was the one keeping secrets. Penelope was already there when he arrived, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She was breathtaking. You clean up well, she noted, giving him an approving glance before turning back to the table. The meeting went smoothly until an unexpected guest arrived. I didn't realize you were here, Lancaster. A deep voice interrupted. Idris turned to see Charles Hartley, a fellow billionaire and business rival, standing at the next table. Penelope frowned. I'm sorry, do you two know each other? This was it. The moment he had to decide whether to keep up the act or come clean, Charles smirked. Oh, I know Idris very well. Penelope's confusion deepened, but before she could ask anything else, Idris stood and extended a hand to her. Penelope, we need to talk. Her eyes darkened with suspicion. What's going on? Taking a steady breath, he met her gaze. There's something you don't know about me. Penelope's gaze sharpened, her lips pressing together as she glanced between Idris and Charles. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, and Idris could see the gears turning in her mind. She was too sharp to let something like this slide. Talk about what? She asked, her tone measured but firm. Idris knew he had no choice now. He had planned to tell her eventually. He just hadn't expected to be forced into it like this. He held out a hand, silently asking her to step away from the table with him. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, her expression unreadable. They moved to a quieter corner of the restaurant, and Idris took a breath before speaking. "My full name is Idris Lancaster." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. Nothing. No flicker of recognition, no shock. Then, after a beat, she frowned. "Okay." Realization hadn't hit yet. "I own the company," he clarified. "The one you work for." Her entire body stiffened. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. He could see the exact moment it clicked, the way her eyes widened just slightly before narrowing again. "You're lying." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his actual business card, handing it to her. The second she saw the embossed lettering, her fingers curled around the edges, gripping it tightly. "You lied to me," she said, her voice low. "I didn't intend to," he admitted. "I came in as an employee to understand how the company was running from the ground level. I wanted to see what worked, what didn't, without people acting differently because they knew who I was." Her jaw clenched. "And you thought deceiving everyone was the way to do that," he exhaled. "I didn't anticipate this." "This," her fingers curled into her palm. "What exactly is this, Idris? Me?" "The fact that I treated you like any other employee instead of a billionaire." She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. That realization settled uncomfortably in his chest. Before he could respond, she straightened, her expression shuddering as she took a step back. "This conversation is over." She turned on her heel and strode away, leaving him standing there with something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. The office felt different the next day. Conversations hushed when Idris walked in, not because anyone else knew the truth, but because Penelope did. And she was avoiding him. He had expected anger, he had expected frustration. But this. The calculated distance, the refusal to even glance his way. He hadn't anticipated how much it would bother him. At midday, while the team worked on their latest project, she moved through the room, giving instructions with her usual precision. When she reached his desk, she barely hesitated, sliding a file onto the surface without looking at him. "Review this and send me your notes by 5. Her voice was clipped, impersonal. Idris leaned back. "Penelope." She turned away as if he hadn't spoken. "Penelope," he said again, this time lower, quieter. She stopped. The tension in her shoulders was undeniable, but she didn't face him. He lowered his voice, ensuring only she could hear. "Ignoring me doesn't change what happened." Her fingers curled just slightly at her sides, but she exhaled and walked away. That was when he knew this wasn't just frustration. She felt betrayed. And for the first time in years, Idris found himself in unfamiliar territory. He cared. That evening, when most employees had left, he found her still at her desk, reviewing documents. The glow from the monitor cast shadows across her face, highlighting the furrow in her brow. "You work too late," he said, stepping inside. She didn't look up. "Some of us don't have the luxury of stepping away whenever we want." The words weren't just about work. He placed his hands in his pockets, resisting the urge to close the space between them. "I want to talk." "No need." She finally met his gaze, her expression controlled. "You did what you did. I understand why." "That doesn't mean I have to be okay with it." "I never meant to deceive you." Her eyes darkened. "But you did." A beat of silence passed. "Would it have made a difference?" he asked. "If you'd known who I was from the start," she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "The point is that I trusted you, Idris. I thought you were someone I could rely on. You let me believe one thing while knowing the truth the entire time." There it was. The real wound beneath the anger. "I didn't expect to feel this way about you," he admitted. "But I do." Her breath caught for a fraction of a second before she masked it. He took a step closer. "Let me fix this." Her throat worked as she swallowed, but her expression remained firm. You can't. Then, before he could say anything else, she grabbed her bag and walked past him, leaving the office without another word. For the first time in his life, Idris Lancaster, billionaire, CEO, and a man who always had control, felt powerless. Idris wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He had built his empire on persistence, on knowing when to push and when to hold back. But when it came to Penelope, every strategy he had ever used in business felt useless. She wasn't another deal to be closed. She was a woman who had every reason to walk away, but he wasn't going to let her. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than everyone else. He waited in the shadows of the lobby, watching as she stepped inside, her posture rigid, her gaze forward, as if she could will herself not to acknowledge his presence. He took a step toward her. "Give me one night," he said. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "For what? To show you who I really am, no lies, no omissions. Just you and me." She exhaled through her nose, considering him for a long, tense moment. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. One night. That was all he needed. When she arrived at the address he had sent, her breath caught in her throat. A rooftop. High above the city, with nothing but soft golden lights draped across the terrace and a table set for two. The skyline stretched endlessly behind it, glowing against the deep blue of the evening sky. The air smelled of roses, the faint scent weaving through the crisp night. She turned to him, arms folded. "Over the top, don't you think?" He slid his hands into his pockets, watching her carefully. "I wanted to give you something that wasn't about business." "Just us." She hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "All right." They sat across from each other, the soft hum of the city below them. For the first time since she learned the truth, he saw the tension in her shoulders ease. "I meant everything I said," he admitted. "I didn't expect to care about you the way I do." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you feel?" He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "That I don't want this to end, that I want to know what it would be like if we weren't just CEO and employee." Her lips parted slightly, her pulse visible at the base of her throat. "This isn't simple, Idris," she said, her voice quieter now. "I don't want simple," he replied. "I want you." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around his. For the first time in days, she didn't pull away. Penelope didn't move her hand from his. A breeze swept across the rooftop, making the candle flames flicker, but the space between them remained still and charged. "I don't know how this works," she admitted, her voice softer than before. Idris traced his thumb over her knuckles, slow and deliberate. "We figure it out together." It wasn't an easy answer, nor was it one that erased the past week of doubt, but for the first time since she'd learned the truth, she wasn't pushing him away. She exhaled, looking down at their hands. "You don't do things halfway, do you?" "With you, no." A quiet laugh escaped her, the first genuine one since everything unraveled. She shook her head, finally meeting his gaze again. "This is insane." "Probably." He leaned forward slightly. "But tell me you don't feel it too." Her lips parted, hesitation flickering across her face. Then, with a slow breath, she nodded. That was all he needed. He rose from his chair and held out a hand. Without a word, she took it, letting him guide her to the edge of the terrace where the city stretched before them. The glow of the skyline reflected in her eyes, making them shine in the dim light. "I should be furious with you," she murmured. "I think you were." "I was." She tilted her head. "Maybe I still am a little." He didn't flinch. "I can live with that." She turned to him fully now, their bodies close enough that he could feel her warmth. He didn't rush, didn't close the space between them entirely. He wanted her to make that choice, and she did. Slowly, tentatively, she reached up, resting a hand against his jaw. Her fingers traced the edge of his stubble, as if memorizing the feel of him. "I still don't know if this is a good idea," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "But I know I don't want to walk away." She inhaled sharply, her lashes lowering just slightly. Then, finally, she closed the distance between them. The kiss was slow, unhurried, and filled with the weight of everything unspoken between them. Her fingers curled against his jaw, and he let himself get lost in the warmth of her, in the way she leaned into him without hesitation. When she finally pulled back, her lips were slightly swollen, her breath uneven. "I'm not sure where this leaves us," she admitted. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering. "Wherever we want it to." For the first time since this began, she didn't argue, she simply nodded. Penelope wasn't sure what to expect the morning after their rooftop dinner, but as she stepped into the office, there was a palpable shift in the air. The weight of their shared truth, the undeniable pull between them, it all lingered like an unspoken promise. She was used to control, to knowing exactly where she stood in every situation. But with Idris, the boundaries had blurred. And despite everything, despite the deception, the frustration, the hesitation, she couldn't deny what she felt. As she made her way to her office, she noticed a small, neatly wrapped box sitting on her desk. No note, no explanation, but she already knew who it was from. Her pulse ticked up as she pulled the ribbon, revealing a sleek, leather-bound notebook. Inside, on the first page, was a handwritten message in bold, precise script. "For every idea you haven't written down yet." Her breath caught. It wasn't extravagant, not in the way she had expected from someone like him. It was thoughtful, personal. A reminder that he saw her, truly saw her. Before she could process it fully, a knock sounded at her door, and then he was there, leaning against the frame with the same quiet confidence that had drawn her in from the beginning. "I figured you'd appreciate something useful," he said, his voice even but his eyes watchful. She ran her fingers over the smooth cover before looking up at him. "You didn't have to do this. I wanted to." The simplicity of his answer sent warmth curling through her. She exhaled slowly. "This is dangerous, Idris." His gaze didn't waver. "I know." She closed the notebook and set it down carefully. "You're my boss. I'm also a man who knows what he wants." Her throat tightened. "And what is that exactly?" He moved closer, closing the door behind him. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them could ignore. "You," he said simply. Her heart pounded, but she held his gaze. "I don't want to be a complication in your life." His expression softened just slightly. "Penelope, you're not a complication, you're a choice. And I'm choosing this." The honesty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent so long guarding herself, keeping her emotions in check. But with him, the walls she had built felt fragile, ready to crumble. She took a breath. "Then we do this on our terms. No workplace expectations. No blurred lines in the office." His lips curved just slightly. "Agreed." She searched his face, looking for hesitation, for anything that might indicate he wasn't fully committed to this. But there was only certainty in his gaze. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to step into the unknown, and when he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers, she let him. Because for once, she wanted to see where this could lead. And something told her with him it would be worth the risk.